So if you thought that gender studies was complicated, just wait till you add sexuality into the mix. Um, so you might also know this as queer theory. That's something that, that's the theory part of it, right? It's the theory, it's called queer theory. The broader field is called sexuality studies or gender and sexuality studies. Oftentimes those go hand in hand and they're considered the same thing, but there are some kind of different focuses. So I'd kind of like to go over those with you guys. Um, so to kind of take you back in about the 1970s, Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, and he influenced a lot of different fields. But he also heavily influenced the field of queer theory. But he published The History of Sexuality. And in it, he suggested two major things that kind of disrupted our understandings of how sexuality works and what it is. First off, that what we know about identity is socially constructed. And that secondly, that we police each other about these constructs in order to keep up the status quo. He actually does kind of historical analysis of that. He points to a 19th century movement by doctors. He says, okay, so in the Victorian era, we have medical practitioners that decided that there was such a thing as sexuality and started asking people to identify as such. And by identifying as such, this coerces people into continuously kind of evaluating and sharing their sexual preferences, asking, what am I? What am I? What am I? Asking for that label, requiring that label. And therefore, for him, sexuality is not only constructed, but it's defined and it's shaped by repetition. And so if this sounds familiar, that's because we kind of think the same thing about gender, right? Go back to Butler's idea that gender is performed and through repetition, it is shaped and it is constructed. And so you're starting to already see those overlaps. This isn't really a surprise that queer theory, as we know it, got its start roughly 1 decade after The History of Sexuality was published in English. So in 1990, we're going to return to Judith Butler because she's also really well known in the queer theory field, which is why I say that gender and sexuality studies go hand in hand, because we rely on a lot of the same scholars and a lot of the same work and a lot of the same ideas. So in Gender Trouble in 1990, Judith Butler establishes that both gender and sexuality together are socially constructed through action, through performance. And for her, performativity, again, is those everyday actions, speech utterances, gestures, representations, dress codes, behaviors, as well as certain prohibitions and taboos that all work together to produce what is perceived as essential feminine or masculine traits, feminine and masculine identity, and that is the repetition of those performances that actually creates our identity. She builds off of Foucault's theory, right? Here, that sexuality is socially constructed, and then she also ends up applying it to gender later in the reading that we had in the previous page. She also builds off the work of Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex that we discussed earlier, who kind of says that the category of woman was developed in opposition to the category of man. But what's important here is that we're also, is even in the 1990s, from the 1970s on to the 1990s, we are saying that not only is gender a construct, but so is sexuality. Now, in 1990, also, you have Suki Sedgwick, who is a really well-known queer theorist. She wrote The Epistemology of the Closet. Now, in The Epistemology of the Closet, she suggests that these binary oppositions limit our freedom and our understanding. By binary oppositions, I mean, systems in which we organize our thoughts about the world. I believe that was coined by Claude Levi-Strauss, or Levi-Strauss, however you want to say it. He believed that humans fundamentally think in binary oppositions: man, woman, heterosexual, homosexual. So, good, bad, public, private. But modern queer theorists really seek to shatter this binary oppositional thinking that you can only be one or the other, because they think it's important to reflect the variety and spectrums of human experience. And that's where a lot of queer theory is based, is this idea that there are spectrums of human experience, that there isn't a binary of heterosexual and homosexual, and that if we base our ideas on Foucault's suggestion that this was actually created anyway, that, this need to identify, this need to pick a side, that we can actually play with it a little bit, and we can kind of look at what's actually going on rather than what we've learned is going on. So we have Suki Sedgwick's, I'm returning here, sorry, to epistemology of the closet, because the idea of the closet is something you're probably familiar with, and it's something that was coined by Suki Sedgwick in Epistemology of the Closet, which to her was the attempt by those with queer traits to conceal them from the public, either partially or entirely. And she analyzes books that depict men with non-masculine traits, that are depicted as cautionary tales that warn of the unhappiness that non-masculinity causes. And she argues that these traits that these tales that we tell about sexuality are crucial to understanding the early development of queer identity. She looks at things like the picture of Dorian Gray, Billy Budd, the remembrance of things past. I don't know if you've read any of these in your courses, but it's really crucial to understand not only how sexuality became an identity, but how these identities were depicted in the early development to help us understand how and why we experience sexual identity today in the ways that we do. So when you think of the closet, you're thinking of that need and that desire to partially or fully keep traits that are considered queer away from others. And so that's why we say you're coming out of the closet when you come out as something other than heterosexual. And so when we think about that idea of heterosexuality, a lot of queer theorists say, okay, so when we position heterosexuality as the default, that's called heteronormativity. We're saying that there is a default way to be, that everyone is born this way, and that somehow some people are aberrations or different. And there's a lot of that same thought with gender studies, right? That, everyone is born either man or woman, and that anybody else who identifies in any other way is aberrant. And so I really want you to think through, when we go into our What is Sexuality module next week, I really want you to be thinking about, okay, so if sexuality is a construct, what does that mean? What does it mean if sexuality is a spectrum? And remembering that history that Foucault taught us about, how people just kind of had their sexual preferences at one point, and those could change, those could be the same, those could, you could have multiple sexual preferences, not just one, and that could change throughout your life, but you never really talked about it, right? You never really, there may have been things that were considered aberrant, but those were usually in terms of acts. There was no being homosexual. There was no being gay. There was no being queer. It wasn't an identity. And that's what he's pointing to, that it became an identity. It became a thing you have to label yourself as. And when we take into the idea of that being a binary and an opposition, and Sedgwick's idea that those binary oppositions need to be overcome and shattered in order to better understand the human experience, that might help us to really understand what the point of queer theory and sexuality studies is. Just like in the module before, in the page before, I have readings from Foucault, Butler, and Sedgwick down below. Pick one, skim through it, get their major points, and get ready to discuss them in the discussion at the end of this module.